Welcome to the last lab of the semester, Lab 16. We are going to cover the later members of the genus Homo, everything from Homo erectus all the way to Homo sapiens. And we'll also discuss some of the theories involved in how we as a species have emerged out of Africa. So let's go ahead and get started. So the later members of the genus Homo, we see that there are some key traits that distinguish them from our earlier species. We find that they have large cranial capacities, more orthognathic faces, smaller teeth. They have postcrania that are more similar to those of modern humans and unlike our earlier relatives, and then they are obligate bipeds. We also see that they had a wider geographic distribution and they lived in places outside of Africa. They also had a more complicated culture and technology. So here is a map showing the distribution of the later Homo species. They've been recovered from major fossil sites in Africa as well as throughout Europe and Asia. And there's a few on here that are really well known. Just overall, right? We've talked about Lake Turkana briefly with the previous ones. The Olduvai Gorge area, the Isle of Flores here, Zucudian, Dmanisi, Neander Valley. So there's a lot of them. And the cool thing about this map, this breakdown distribution, is that it's all color-coded. So our Homo erectus / Homo ergaster is in black, Homo heidelbergensis in blue. This teal color is more of a Homo neanderthalensis, and then our Homo sapiens in this orange-like color. So let's start with our first one, and it's Homo erectus. Homo erectus lived anywhere between 1.8 million years ago to 300,000 years ago in Africa and Asia. They lived in Europe from 1.8 million years ago to 400,000 years ago. So now this is the first one that we're talking about that is not just in Africa, but also in Asia and in Europe. So Homo erectus had larger cranial capacities with an estimate of around 950 cc's than our previous species did, but it had variation in this size. So it's not just 950 across the board, there was variation in cranial capacity size. Crania were generally long and low. They were shaped like footballs when you see them from the side. Homo erectus had pronounced brow ridges. They had relatively orthognathic faces. And what's interesting is they also have this occipital torus. The occipital torus is this unusual projection at the back of the skull, and it runs along that occipital bone, forming a small point when it's seen from the side. It really lends to that football-shaped head. Smaller mandibles and teeth are found in Homo erectus, particularly when you're looking at the premolars and molars, than we find in earlier species like our Australopithecines. Just to go back, this is the football-shaped head that we're talking about, right? And this is the occipital torus that we have here. It's this long and low crania. The earliest and most famous Homo erectus specimen is named Nariokatomi, or Turkana boy, after the site in Eastern Africa where the specimen was recovered. He is a relatively complete skeleton from a single individual, and it's believed that he was around 8 to 10 years old when he died. This individual provides good evidence of Homo erectus postcranial traits. He had long legs, shorter arms, he had a barrel-shaped rib cage, and he had angled femurs. So we have evidence, again, for bipedalism, especially with those postcranial traits in Homo erectus and Turkana boy. Homo erectus analysis of his skeleton also suggests that he would have been close to about 6 feet or 1.8 meters tall if he had grown into adulthood. Evidence from fossilized dental remains and stone tools suggests that Homo erectus had a diverse diet that included more meat than those of our earlier species. It was originally believed that Homo erectus had less sexual dimorphism than earlier species, which suggests a shift away from that polygynous social structure that was suggested in some of our other species. However, recent evidence suggests that Homo erectus may have maintained a higher degree of sexual dimorphism and likely a polygynous social structure of our earlier fossil species. Early Homo erectus individuals used Oldowan tools, but around 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus began to make and use new kinds of tools. These newer tools are considered to be part of the Acheulean technology. The Acheulean technology, we have bifaces and hand axes. Bifaces are stone tools that have had flakes of stone removed from two sides. The most common biface in Acheulean sites is that hand axe. So a hand axe is a biface tool that is shaped like a pear or a teardrop, with one end that is larger and rounded and another end that is more narrow and pointed. Compared to the earlier Oldowan tools, Acheulean tools were manufactured through a slightly more complicated process that required more steps to produce the desired shape. In addition, the tools were more standardized than our Oldowan tools. So remember, in the Oldowan tools, it was this chopper and flakes. You would kind of hit the rock, and whatever flaked off, that was your flake, and then you were left with the chopper. But here, it was there's a more standardized method of producing them. One of the most significant aspects of Homo erectus is its geographic distribution. So Homo erectus was the first species of our genus to leave Africa. And then within a few tens of thousands of years, Homo erectus was found as far away from Africa as southern Asia. So this is a very, very important thing to note about Homo erectus. The fact that it was the first of our ancestors to leave out of Africa. Homo erectus itself means upright man. So that kind of gives you a hint into that, the bipedal importance of bipedalism here. So here is this Homo erectus migration. Again, it was the first member of our lineage to move out of Africa and settle in the various areas of Europe and Asia. This migration was facilitated by the species' generalized anatomy and their flexible technology. So the migration into Eurasia between 1.8 million years ago and 800,000 years ago, sometimes called Out of Africa 1, was related to environmental shifts and changing food availability. Homo erectus did not consciously set out to move to a new place. It wasn't like they were like, well, we don't really like this area that we're in. Let's just kind of leave and explore and see if we find somewhere new. It wasn't about, just consciously setting out to leave. It was this shift in the environment and a change in the food availability that they had. The species probably moved a little further east with every generation or two. And so one generation would move east, they would settle there, then one or two generations would pass, they would decide they needed to move on again, and they would just continue doing that. And so what they were doing is they were just moving farther and farther eastwards. They took advantage of the wild animal herds and plant foods available in the area. And over many generations, Homo erectus had this diverse diet and a generalized anatomy that allowed it to do well in a wide range of habitats. As with Homo habilis, there's a significant variation within Homo erectus fossils, which again suggests that the African and non-African individuals, particularly those from Asia, may form two distinct groups. So the non-African fossils show a more exaggerated version of the traits seen in the African fossils. So we have differences between what we separate out as Homo ergaster and Homo erectus, with Homo erectus having a sagittal keel and Homo ergaster not having that. So specifically, members of the non-African group had thicker cranial bones and even longer and lower crania. They were more pronounced in the brow ridges, and they had a more pronounced occipital torus and a unique cranial feature called the sagittal keel. The sagittal keel is a slight ridge of bone, and it runs along the midline of the cranium. So you think of gorillas and their sagittal crest. Homo erectus, the non-African members of Homo erectus had a sagittal keel. Although it's located in the same position of that sagittal crest, it is much less pronounced, and it does not relate to chewing muscle adaptation. Homo erectus was a little shorter and stockier, the Asian counterparts, than their African counterparts. And some researchers believe that these differences are significant enough to warrant classifying the African and non-African fossils into two different species. They argue that the more generalized African group should be called Homo ergaster, while the more exaggerated non-African group should be called Homo erectus. So Homo erectus, Homo ergaster, interchangeable. Just know that Homo erectus is for that, they now will include it in the non-African group, and then Homo ergaster in the African group. Next, we have Homo heidelbergensis, and Homo heidelbergensis lived around 600,000 years ago in Africa and in Europe. Homo heidelbergensis lived in these areas anywhere from 600 to 130,000 years ago in Africa and Europe, and then in Asia anywhere from 200 to 130,000 years ago. So Homo heidelbergensis has several traits in common with Homo erectus: the long low crania, the large brow ridges, and some had a small occipital torus. However, they also had some unique traits that differentiate them out from Homo erectus, those being the large cranial capacity of 1200 to 1300 cc's and smaller back teeth. As with our earlier members of the genus Homo, there is debate about how best to classify these fossils. Few researchers argue that they share key features in common with modern humans, that very large cranial capacity being one of them. But these researchers also acknowledge that these fossils are also different from us, especially when we're looking at their cranial robusticity. So to account for that robusticity, the fossils are really considered to be archaic or early Homo sapiens, as opposed to anatomically modern Homo sapiens or humans of today. In contrast, other researchers will emphasize the uniqueness of the fossil group. So that large cranial capacity of Homo heidelbergensis is believed to reflect a general trend overall toward a larger cranial capacity that began with the earlier members of the genus Homo. But it's not significant enough to warrant placing them in our own species. Homo heidelbergensis had a diverse diet that included meat from big game animals, and tools and other evidence recovered from Homo heidelbergensis sites suggest that they actively hunted large animals, likely facilitated by a shift in their stone tool technology that occurred during this time. So this brings us to that shift in tool technology. This is actually a tool technology that is well known and for a very, very long time was just known to be used by Homo neanderthalensis, but now we see that they actually use it. So early Homo heidelbergensis used Acheulean tools, similar to those used by Homo erectus, but our later members of Homo heidelbergensis used a new tool technology, and this is called Mousterian technology. So Mousterian technology, named after a site in France, Le Moustier, I don't know how to say it, Mousterian tool technology, and it's very different from the earlier stone tool technologies. So really quickly, I'm going to go over this and we'll talk about it again. So here with Mousterian tool technology, you have a large stone of flint. You choose that. Flakes are removed from the perimeter using an antler or another tool. Once the side of the stone has flakes removed from the entire surface, it gives it the appearance of a tortoise shell. Then you have a heavy specific blow that is directed at one end of the flake of the stone, removing a large flake. This flake then is convex on one side and then flat in another. The flake can now then be used for scraping, cutting, and then further flake removal will produce a more specialized tool. So Homo heidelbergensis is very interesting in the fact that they have this Mousterian tool technology. In both our Oldowan technology and our Acheulean technologies, a lot of emphasis was placed on that core tool, which is the tool that was left behind when the flakes were removed. From a Mousterian tool maker, it wasn't the core tool that was most important, it was the flakes themselves. The flakes were modified into a wide range of shapes that were able then to be used for specific tasks, anything from scraping to drilling and cutting. Whereas the Oldowan and Acheulean tool makers used a few generalized tools to perform countless functions, the Mousterian tool makers used a specific tool for each function. So And then one thing is that you would even have to, or attach stone points onto wood to make stone tip spears. So the way that I think about this, and I remember this a little bit better, or the fact that Mousterian tool technology is more specialized, is I think of kitchen cutting knives. I love to cook. I have a lot of tools in my kitchen that I use for various different tasks, right? You use a mixer for one thing. I've got a gnocchi board if I'm making gnocchi. I've got a pasta maker if I'm making pasta. Anything like that. But one thing that I use for me personally, that I align this with that old one in our Chilean tool technology, is it's a 6-inch chef's utility knife. And so why I say it reminds me of the older one in our Chilean tool technologies is because you can use that knife for pretty much everything in the kitchen. And I'll draw it out for you. And just think of knives right now when I'm doing this. So in a that 6-inch chef's utility knife, just in case you don't know what it looks like, it's like straight, and then it has this curve, and then you have your handle, right? And it's terrible drawing. If I could erase that, actually. All right, so let me see if I can redo that, just because I want you to see, right? It has this like curve, right? It's a terrible looking knife. Actually, it kind of goes more out not like that. It's so much easier on a whiteboard. Goes more. Here's my pen. Here's the knife. It curves out this way, and then it goes up. That's what it looks like. And then you've got your handle. Right. So that's 6-inch chef's utility knife. You can use it for absolutely everything, and at least I do. So that's older one, our Chilean technologies. You have this one simple tool that you use for absolutely everything. However, in Mousterian tool technology, right, it was the specialization of your tool, right? And this is where I think about all the other knives that I have but I never use, because I like that specific knife when I'm cooking, right? If you think about knives, you have a paring knife, you've got a fillet knife, you've got a bread knife, you've got steak knives, you've got a hunting knife, you can do all those different types of knives that are available. That's Mousterian tool technology. If you think about it that way, align it with knives. You have specialized tools for each different function. Whereas in older one tool technology, I think of my utility knife, and you've got that one tool for countless functions. So just to keep it, keep it separated, I guess. Older one, our Chilean, one tool, multiple functions. Older ones, your choppers and your flakes. Our Chilean, you got your hand axes. Mousterian tool, countless, different tools for a bunch of different functions. And then the fact that our Homo heidelbergensis members would have stone points onto wood to make stone tipped spears. Okay? So that's just my way of remembering it. In order to produce Mousterian tools, you need a more complicated production process. This is called the Lavalois technique. In this process, the tool maker would first remove the flakes. This is what I showed you in the image, right? You would first remove the flakes from around the core of the rock. You would create a tortoise-like outside. Then you would hit the rock, and then you would break off that flake. You would repeat this process over and over again, and your same core then could be used to yield a numerous amount of flakes that all had roughly the same shape and size. After they'd prepare the flakes, the tool maker would then remove pieces of stone to form the edge of the flake, to form the specific tool that was desired. While the flake tools were shaped differently for different functions, these shapes were actually standardized across the Mousterian sites. So anywhere that you would find Mousterian tools, essentially it was the same standardized shape. So what we're seeing now, if you take that into consideration, is that they were passing along the knowledge on how to create these Mousterian tools using this Lavallois technique. So they would use this technique every single time. And so this is spanning hundreds and thousands of miles as well as generations. So this is information that's passed on from one generation to the next and one family to the next. So that's Homo heidelbergensis. What ties us into our next group is our Mousterian tool technology, right? Because like I said, Mousterian tool technology used to be mostly well known as Neanderthals. You would say Mousterian tools, you automatically think Neanderthals. So Homo neanderthalensis is perhaps the most famous of our extinct fossil relatives. Homo neanderthalensis lived around 130,000 to 30,000 years ago. So it's fairly recent that they died out. And Homo neanderthalensis lived in Europe and Western Asia. Just a quick, I know, because some people pick on like the TH and, you know, Neanderthal versus Neanderthal and the debate around that. I will admit it used to be a pet peeve of mine. Not anymore. I don't really care anymore. Neanderthal is the way that I say it because it was named by Germans, and that's in the Neander Valley, and so that's how they pronounce it. That said, I no longer actually correct people for saying it differently. But anyways, just kind of a fun fact, I guess. I don't know if it was very fun for you guys. But Neanderthalensis, Homo neanderthalensis. Homo neanderthalensis shared several traits in common with the earlier Homo heidelbergensis fossils. These traits are the long and low cranium, the large brow ridges, the small back teeth, and the highly worn incisors. However, Homo neanderthalensis had several unique traits. One of it is that incredibly large cranial capacity that they had. They had anywhere from 1245 or 1245 to 1740 cc's. So they had very large brains. They also had an occipital bun, and this occipital bun, it's different from the occipital torus, and it's a large round projection that is located on the occipital bone. So remember, the occipital torus is more like a ridge. This is an actual projection. The one interesting thing that I want to point out is that highly worn incisors that both Homo neanderthalensis and Homo heidelbergensis share. Right, highly worn incisors suggests that these species were using their front teeth as tools. And so one thing is like, okay, so what do you mean by using teeth as tools? And the way that I think about it is like, if you've ever tried to tie something onto your wrist and you need to use your mouth in order to tie it on, that's like using your teeth as a tool. But in this case, it's probably something like they had to hold the skin of an animal, and they, like, in order to like clean off the fur or stretch it out, they have to hold it in their teeth and pull it, and then use the tools that they needed for that, or in any other way of using teeth as tools, right? And then the other thing that I want to point out is, on average, the Neanderthal cranial capacity was around like 15-20, so in the middle of those ranges. But to give us perspective, the average human cranial capacity is 1400 cc's. So they had larger brains than we do. But if we take into account the estimates of Neanderthal body weight and their brain to body ratio, we actually find that the brain to body ratio is lower than that of the average human today. So it's just to put that into perspective. They did have very large cranial capacities, but and which is larger than us modern humans, but that brain to body ratio was also smaller than us modern humans. So Neanderthals also had several adaptations that helped them in their extreme environments. During the time of the Neanderthals, the planet was experiencing a massive ice age, and during certain times, a lot of Europe was covered in glaciers, and the temperatures were considerably colder than it is today. The non-glaciated areas of southern Europe would have been bitterly cold. These are habitats similar to what we find in Scandinavia, northern Russia, Alaska, or northern Canada today. So think of this like frozen tundra, essentially. In addition to their physical adaptations, Neanderthals had cultural adaptations that helped them survive in the Ice Age Europe. Their physical adaptations that we see in Neanderthals is that they had these very large nasal openings that may have helped to warm the air as they inhaled it. We also see that they had stocky bodies that helped them to retain that body heat. So if you think back to human variation, you should think Bergman's rule right away. Again, in addition to those physical adaptations, they did have cultural adaptations that helped them survive in Ice Age Europe. These being that they built fires, they made use of caves as shelters, and they probably had rudimentary clothing. Similar to Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals had a diverse diet that emphasized big game animals. These animals were hunted using Mousterian tools, which required the Neanderthals to spear their prey at close range. So this brings us to the next thing. Spearing large animals at close range is a very risky hunting technique. Along with other aspects of their life, this resulted in a lot of physical injuries, and we see this reflected in the skeletal remains of Neanderthals. So despite being stocky and robust, many Neanderthal fossils show evidence of traumatic injuries, such as broken bones. These injuries, and what's interesting about them, is that these injuries are often healed. And what that suggests is that the individual survives multiple injuries over a lifetime. In some cases, the injured individuals would have been permanently disabled and may have required assistance from other members of the group to survive. So it's very, very interesting to see that, because what it suggests now is that there is a degree of culture, a degree of social awareness, and the value of taking care of others that is reflected in Homo neanderthalensis. Okay, so in addition to possibly caring for their sick and injured, the Neanderthals regularly and intentionally buried their dead. So this is this argument for Neanderthals having a culture. So really quickly, or sort of quickly, I want to go over the four Shanidar remains, because these are burials that really, really changed the way that we think of Homo neanderthalensis. So I'll start with Shanidar 1, and they're named Shanidar 1, 2, 3, and 4. So Shanidar 1 was an elderly Neanderthal male. The excavators would call him Nandi. Nandi was aged anywhere between 40 and 50 years old, which is remarkably old for a Neanderthal. Nandi displayed severe signs of deformity. So he is one of four possibly or reasonably complete skeletons from the cave which displayed trauma-related abnormalities, which in his case would have been debilitating to the point of making his day-to-day life painful. So at some point in his life, Nandi suffered a violent blow to the left side of his face, creating a crushing fracture to his left orbit, which would have left him partially or totally blind in one eye. Analysis shows that Shanidar 1 likely suffered from profound hearing loss, as his left ear canal was partially blocked and his right ear canal was completely blocked by exostosis. Nandi also suffered from a withered right arm, which had been fractured in several places and healed, but this caused the loss of his lower arm and his hand. Thought to either be congenital, this was thought to either be congenital or a result of childhood disease and trauma, or due to an amputation later in life. The arm had healed, but the injury may have caused some paralysis down his right side, leading to deformities in his lower legs and foot, and would have resulted in him walking with a pronounced painful limp. All of these injuries were acquired long before death, showing extensive healing, and this has been used then to infer that Neanderthals looked after their sick and aged, denoting implicit group concern. So that's Shanidar 1. Shanidar 2 was an adult male who evidently died of a rock fall inside the cave, as his skull and bones were crushed. This is evidence, there's evidence here that Shanidar 2 was given a ritual send-off. There was a small pile of stones with some worked stone points made out of chert. which were found on top of his grave. There had also been a large fire by the burial site. So Shanidar 1, the importance is that it shows group concern, right? They had to take care of him because his day-to-day life was painful, and he was severely disabled. Shanidar 2 shows that there was a ritual send-off, right? He was given a ritual send-off. So that's the importance of that. So again, and more evidence for a complex culture. So Shanidar 3 was a 40 to 50-year-old male found in the same grave as Shanidar 1 and 2. Shanidar 3 had a wound to the left ninth rib, which suggests that the individual died of complications from a stab wound by a sharp implement. However, there is bone growth around the wound, which indicates then that Shanidar 3 lived for at least several weeks after the injury with the object still embedded in him. The angle of the wound rules out self-infliction, but it is consistent with an accidental or purposeful stabbing by another individual. Recent research has suggested that the injury may have been caused by a long-range projectile. This would be the earliest example then of interpersonal or interspecific violence in the human fossil record, and the only such example amongst Neanderthals. The presence of early modern humans, possibly armed with projectile weapons in Western Asia around the same time, also raises the possibility of interspecies conflict. Shanidar 3 also suffered from a degenerative joint disorder in his foot, which resulted from a fracture or a sprain, which would have resulted in painful limited movement. So Shanidar 3 is interesting for those reasons, right? The fact that he lived for at least 3 weeks after his injury, and the fact that this injury could not have been caused by himself, right? It's either interpersonal, interspecific violence or interspecies conflict that resulted in his injury, right? And then Shanidar 4. Shanidar 4 was an adult male, aged 30 to 45 years, and was discovered by Selecki in 1960. Shanidar 4 was positioned on his left side in a partial fetal position. For many years, Shanidar 4 was thought to provide strong evidence for a Neanderthal burial ritual. So we get from this, and the reason why we think that Shanidar 4 was evidence for a burial ritual was through the soil samples that were taken from around the body. Routine soil samples were gathered for pollen analysis in an attempt to reconstruct the paleoclimate and vegetational history of the site, and they were analyzed 8 years after its discovery. So in two of the soil samples in particular, there were whole clumps of pollen that were discovered, in addition to the usual pollen found throughout the site, which suggests that entire flowering plants, or at least the heads of plants, had been part of the grave deposit. So kind of like putting flowers on a grave. Furthermore, a study of the particular flower types suggests that the flowers may have been chosen for their specific medicinal purposes. So yarrow, cornflower, bachelor's button, St. Barnaby's thistle, ragwort or groundsel, and grape hyacinth, joint pine or woody horsetail, and hollyhock were represented in the pollen samples. All of these have long known curative powers. Things like diuretics, stimulants, astringents, as well as anti-inflammatory properties can be found in all of these flowers. What this led to then is this idea that the man, Shanidar 4, could possibly have had shamanic powers. Perhaps he acted as the medicine man to the Shanidar Neanderthals, and therefore they buried him with these medicinal property flowers. However, like every good theory, there is another theory to debunk it. Recent work has suggested that perhaps that pollen was introduced to the burial site by animal action, because there are several burrows of a gerbil-like rodent known as the Persian jurd, which were found nearby. So the jurd is known to store large numbers of seeds and flowers at certain points in their burrows, and this argument was used in conjunction with the lack of ritual treatment of the rest of the skeletons in the caves to suggest that the Shanidar 4 burial just had natural, not cultural origins. Paul B. Petit has stated that the deliberate placement of flowers has now pretty much been convincingly eliminated, noting that a recent examination of the microfauna from the strata into which the grave was cut suggests that the pollen was deposited by the burrowing rodent, which in the region, which is common in the Shanidar microfauna and whose burrowing activity can be observed today. Despite his conclusions that the flowers were unlikely to have been deliberately placed, Petit nevertheless, though, concludes that the Shanidar burials, because they happened over so many years, represent a deliberate mortuary practice by Neanderthals. So this researcher essentially said that this Persian jerd, this rodent, is known to burrow, and we can still see it burrowing. So the fact that it's possible that maybe these flowers, and it's more likely that these flowers, the pollen from these flowers, came here as a result of that rodent. But he's not entirely, which kind of blows out the theory of, okay, he was a medicine man and it was a highly cultural shamanic burial, kind of takes that out of consideration. But he says that he is not 100% getting rid of the idea of mortuary practice in Neanderthals because they happened over several years, right? So, again, theories come and theories go, and it's not until they're proven 100%, and I don't think this is one that will be proven 100% anytime soon. So all of these burials, Shanidars 1 through 4, reflect some sense of abstract thinking. This is an idea, it's the idea of spirituality or consideration of an afterlife. Because if you think about it, if there was no idea of an afterlife, there's no idea of a spirituality in, of a sense, then there wouldn't be this careful thought put into the burial of a person, of a Neanderthal. That's the argument for it, right? The fact that they ritualistically or deliberately practiced mortuary practices and buried the dead in the same spot over several years, that the argument is that then they had some sort of spiritual or thinking, this abstract thinking of, or consideration of an afterlife. Right, so that's the argument. Alternatively, right, again, for every theory, there's another theory to debunk it. The burials just might reflect a more basic need to contain decomposition and avoid detection by predators and scavengers. So you can decide if you want them to have culture or not, but again, these theories are still in debate. I kind of like the idea of them having their own culture and complex thought and abstract thought. There is evidence that some Neanderthals made non-functional objects, things like decorated shells that may have been used as pendants or other personal ornaments. These types of artifacts are primarily associated with our own species, and the production of these things by Neanderthals supports the idea that they may have been symbolic thinkers. There's also evidence, both from the fossil record and DNA analysis, that suggests that Neanderthals may have had the ability to produce language. Although that language may not have directly resembled human language today, it may still have been possible for Neanderthals to engage in complex forms of communication. Additional evidence for Neanderthals' complex thinking is found in their dental calculus, or the hardened plaque in their teeth. Chemical analysis of their dental calculus indicates that they regularly incorporated a range of plants into their diet, including plants with little nutritional value that may have been consumed for medicinal purposes instead. This finding demonstrates that Neanderthals had not only sophisticated hunting technology, but they also had knowledge about the diverse plants in their environment. The abilities and thought processes of Neanderthals are hotly debated, with some researchers arguing that Neanderthals had abilities similar to modern people, and other researchers that argue that Neanderthals had far more limited abilities than humans. The debate over Neanderthal culture and symbolism feeds into a larger debate about the human relationship with Neanderthals, between Neanderthals and humans. Some researchers highlight the similarities between Neanderthals and humans, and they believe that the two groups are closely related. These researchers often will classify Homo neanderthalensis as an archaic Homo sapiens, along with Homo heidelbergensis. In the classification debates about most Homo species, we have to turn to the fossil record for evidence. So what this does is it limits us to differences in the size and shape of skeletal features as in Homo heidelbergensis. In the debate surrounding Neanderthal classification, however, we also have another line of evidence which is available, and that's their ancient DNA. So, like I said, Homo neanderthalensis was around pretty recently, and so most fossils when they're mineralized, there's no longer any organic material and there's no DNA. However, because some Neanderthals died pretty recently or recently enough, their skeletons have not fully fossilized. So what this means is that in some cases, researchers have been able to extract trace amounts of Neanderthal DNA for analysis. So studies along these lines have examined both mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA. The mitochondrial DNA evidence suggests that humans arose from a lineage in Africa that was separate from Neanderthal populations that lived in Europe and Western Asia. However, the nuclear DNA evidence suggests that when the humans arrived in these places from Africa, they interbred with Neanderthals that already lived in the region. When combined, these results indicate that while humans and Neanderthals are related and share minor genetic similarities, they are probably different species with unique evolutionary origins and histories. So if anyone or any of you guys have ever taken like an Ancestry.com or a 23andMe or in the past there was Genus 2.0 with the National Geographic Project, it would tell you the percentage of Neanderthal DNA that you had in your genetic material. And in some cases, some people who have, I think it's Oceania, like Australia, Oceania ancestry, they could even have Denisovan DNA. But most people really just get Neanderthal DNA back. And both my parents did take their ancestry DNA, and it turns out that both my parents have around like 2.5 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, which I think is actually on the lower side. I know the highest is around 6%. So if you're interested, you can take a DNA, like an ancestry test, and find out how much Neanderthal DNA you have in your own genetic material. That's something that I was actually really excited to find out, among other things, when my parents did theirs. So that's Homo neanderthalensis. That brings us now to Homo sapiens. So our own species, Homo sapiens, first appeared in Africa around 200,000 years ago. It appeared in Western Asia around 100,000 years ago. In Australia around 50,000 years ago. In Europe around 35,000 years ago. And then in the Americas around 12 to 15,000 years ago. In general, Homo sapien individuals were much more gracile than our earlier Homo species, especially when you compare them to the robust Neanderthal contemporaries. However, these early humans of our species were still slightly more robust than humans today. They had small orthognathic faces with small brow ridges. They had small front and back teeth. They had a pronounced chin on the front of the mandible. The overall cranial shape was tall and rounded, which gave Homo sapiens a distinct vertical forehead. They had large cranial capacities of around 1350 cc's and a rounded occipital area without any specialized structures such as the occipital torus or the occipital bun. Their postcrania were relatively gracile, with a long and lean body type that was generalized and suitable for a range of environments. From the beginning, Homo sapiens had diverse diets that included a wider range of prey than those of other Homo species. They hunted and ate medium-sized game animals such as ancient deer species, as well as smaller game such as birds and fish. Humans made complex clothes using needles, and they had complex shelters that required building rather than simply taking advantage of a naturally formed cave. Homo sapiens had a more complicated culture and symbolic behavior than we see with our earlier Homo species, and we can see that with the use of needles and built shelters. They also engaged in a wide range of symbolic behaviors. Their burials were more ritualistic than Neanderthal burials, and they regularly interred their dead with special tools, jewelry, and other kinds of grave goods. They also produced a variety of symbolic objects such as carved figurines and cave paintings. Although these symbolic creations are often referred to as arts, the actual purpose behind their production is quite unclear. While the European examples are the most famous, there's similar symbolic behavior that was present in Africa and Asia before it even appeared in Europe. What's interesting about the cave paintings is that there is debate that surrounds them. Some researchers believe that the paintings are actually evidence of magical thinking. And it's this idea that if you, kind of like the idea of like a journal, or like when you put your goals down on paper, the idea that when you put it down on paper, it'll manifest itself. It's the same idea for the cave paintings, right? So some researchers believe that it was our ancient ancestors putting paintings up of like a successful hunt, so that a successful hunt could happen, right? Because that's what a lot of the cave paintings are, like a successful hunt or things that are going on. So there's just an interesting fact about the cave paintings. Homo sapiens used a new stone technology that was not seen in any other species. So to recap, we've covered Oldowan tool technology, which is the choppers and the flakes, right? Then we covered Acheulean tool technology, which is similar to Oldowan, but they had what we called the hand axes. Then we covered Mousterian tool technology, which automatically you should think Neanderthals, but also think Homo heidelbergensis. And now we have this new tool technology that was not seen in any other species. And so this technology is referred to as the Upper Paleolithic technology. Paleolithic referring to the Stone Age. Upper is the most recent in a series of 3 Stone Age periods. So the lower, the middle, the upper. And then the Upper Paleolithic, what it translates then to when you put that together, is Late Stone Age. So in Africa, the corresponding cultural period is referred to by this latter alternate name, so the Late Stone Age. So Upper Paleolithic, Late Stone Age, you can go back and forth with those two. And so this Upper Paleolithic tool technology was in Europe and the last Stone Age in Africa. This period dates from about 40 to 10,000 years ago. Similar technologies appeared in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere around the same time and can be clustered together under this heading. As with our Mousterian tools, the Upper Paleolithic toolkit emphasized the flake tools. However, the Upper Paleolithic flakes had a special elongated form, with the flakes being at least twice as long as they were wide, which you can see in this image here. I mean, this is actually a lot longer than it is wide, but they were longer essentially. So these elongated flakes are called blades. Producing stone blades required an even more lengthy and difficult process than the Levallois technique, and raw blades still needed to be further modified to make specific tools. As with our Mousterian tools, the Upper Paleolithic blade tools were specialized for different functions and included scrapers, drills, knives, stone arrow points, and more. These tool types were standardized within a region. So, for example, multiple drills at a site had the same size and shape. So they were standardized. However, the tools' forms often varied from one region to the next, with each region having a particular shape, preference, and style. So that's one thing. This image here just shows, is just an example of a not a variation, but a different tool use. Homo sapiens invented the atlatl. The atlatl is a notched stick that helps them throw lightweight spears farther than before. So it was very important. You could say that this then prevents the need to hunt game at a close range, which is less dangerous than hunting at a close range. So interestingly, Upper Paleolithic toolmakers were very selective about their raw materials, and these raw materials would be passed along these long-distance trade networks across hundreds of miles. In addition, they would make a variety of objects from materials other than stone, so harpoons made from animal bones, beads and pendants made from shells, and tools made from antlers. So the image here is an Upper Paleolithic tool. And this is a tool made from bone, actually from antler, It's a barbed harpoon. It's carved into the antler, and this was used to catch fish. So Homo sapiens coexisted with other Homo species in various parts of the world. Most famously, they coexisted with Neanderthals in Western Asia for around 50,000 years and in Europe for around 5,000 years. It's unclear to what extent they interacted with each other during these times, but based on the available evidence, it appears that the two groups probably did not engage in regular conflict on a large scale. Neanderthals were subject to frequent injury, but these injuries cannot be clearly credited to attacks from modern Homo sapiens. At the time, the two groups may have engaged in more peaceful interactions. So, for example, some evidence suggests that they may have been influenced either directly or indirectly by the more complicated techniques introduced by humans. Other evidence, again, indicates that the two groups interacted more directly through interbreeding. So today, humans occupy most of Earth's continents year-round with the exception of Antarctica. Many researchers have attempted to answer the questions regarding where we came from and how did we get to all these places, resulting in three popular explanations for the origin and dispersal of our species. One is the replacement model. Then we have the assimilation model. And I am missing, I think, the multi-regional model here. So first is the replacement model. Also known as out of Africa too. And this is an explanation for the evolution of humans that argues that the species evolved in Africa and then expanded to other regions, replacing related species as it went. This model argues that modern humans originated in Africa recently. From there, we spread into Western Asia, Europe, Eastern Asia, and beyond. Once we arrived in these regions, Homo sapiens replaced the earlier Homo species that occupied the territories, such as Homo neanderthalensis in Europe or Homo erectus in Asia. So this view argues that all humans today have recent common ancestry in Africa, and there was little to no interbreeding between humans and other species, and any variation in people today is superficial and it evolved recently. So that's the replacement model. Then we have the multi-regional model. The multi-regional model is an explanation for the evolution of humans that argues that Homo sapiens evolved from an earlier species, like Homo erectus, in multiple regions. So you have them evolving in multiple regions. Evolution happening in multiple regions, that's what I was trying to say. This happened at the same time, or roughly the same time. So thus, humans in Asia evolved from Homo erectus in Asia, and humans in Africa evolved from Homo erectus in Africa, and so on. This model argues that populations in these regions then interbred, which then made them similar to one another through gene flow. This view argues that there are multiple points of origin for our species, and some variations in people today may go back hundreds of thousands of years to the regional difference in Homo erectus populations. So that's the multi-regional model. So we've covered the replacement model, covered the multi-regional model. Now we have the assimilation model. So assimilation model has been proposed more recently, right? This is one that is growing more support for the explanation of human origins. And it's been proposed more recently, and it combines the African origin and the interbreeding of the two other models, the out of Africa 2 and the multi-regional theory. According to this model, this assimilation model, Homo sapiens first evolved in Africa. Right? From there, the species spread into other regions. When they settled in these regions, humans did not completely replace the earlier Homo sapiens. Rather, they interbred with the local populations, such as the Neanderthals in Europe. Current evidence actually supports the assimilation model more than the prior two models, the out of Africa 2 or the multi-regional model. Given how each region of fossils dates from the oldest in Africa and the newest in the Americas, the fossil data suggests that we originated in Africa and then dispersed to the rest of the world. The genetic data also supports that hypothesis. So researchers have studied the mitochondrial DNA to track female lineages and then the Y chromosome DNA to track male lineages. These two forms of DNA do not recombine, so they accumulate changes very slowly and can be used to estimate when groups split apart and began to separate evolutionary tracks. Analysis of both mitochondrial and Y chromosome DNA in living humans shows that the greatest genetic diversity is found in Africa. So what that suggests then is that African populations have had the most time to accumulate mutations or variations in their DNA. Genetic variation is increasingly limited the further you get away from Africa. So what that suggests is that multiple founder effect situations occurred as humans moved out of Africa. With each migration further eastwards, only a subset of the existing variation migrated onwards. This pattern of decreasing variation suggests that people first migrated out of Africa along the South Asian coast. Subgroups then moved north and west into Eurasia, and the genetic information matches very nicely with the pattern of fossil data that shows that East Asia and Australia were settled before Europe. Thus, both the fossil and the genetic evidence supports an African origin. According to recent analysis of Neanderthal DNA, it appears that the last common ancestor of Neanderthals and humans lived as long ago as 800,000 years ago. Meanwhile, the last common ancestor for all Neanderthals lived only 140,000 years ago. So what this suggests is that the Neanderthals and human lineages split long before the recent species evolved. Thus, they're likely to be two distinct species rather than two closely related subspecies of humans. Neanderthal DNA is more similar to the DNA of non-African humans than it is to African humans. So the similarity between Neanderthal and non-African genomes suggests that humans interbred with Neanderthals after they left Africa. Okay, and so I know Homo sapiens would be where we would end things, but there are some that don't quite fit into the timeline. And so it's Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, and the Denisovans. And those are the last three that we're going to talk about. So Homo naledi was discovered after a tip from local spelunkers in the Rising Star Cave in the Republic of South Africa in 2013. So paleoanthropologists went in and they found these remains. The site was incredibly difficult to access, and this is something that I find so interesting about this excavation is that it was so difficult to access the site that the excavation was completed by an all-female crew whose small body sizes allowed them to make the narrow climb into the cave chamber. After careful excavation, the cave yielded the largest number of fossil remains from a single species found anywhere in Africa. So, I think the story goes that the original researchers, I mean, they were men and they were too large to pass through the cage, so they put out a Facebook post asking for young, or not even young, but like female, small, bioanthropologists who were not scared of small spaces, claustrophobic is the word I was looking for, and could go through and do this. And so, and then they got, some women answered their call for it, and that's, you've got a full female crew of women who were able to access these specimens. Again, this yielded the largest number of fossil remains from a single species found anywhere in Africa. Researchers have identified at least 15 individuals using clues such as their distinct dental eruption and tooth wear patterns. And these specimens assigned to the new species Homo naledi had a few traits in common with their earlier australopiths, such as the small cranial capacities of around 465 to 560 cc's and shoulders suited for arboreal climbing. However, they had more in common with Homo erectus, such as a sagittal keel, large brow ridge, smaller teeth and mandible, and a human-like foot well suited for bipedalism. So, that's why they're in our genus Homo as opposed to Australopithecines. Just to give you an idea, this is the Rising Star Cave. So here's the entrance. It's a very, very long trek. Here's the entrance. It's above. You're above sea level. Down. Go down here. They have to do a Superman crawl to get through here. Here's a human for scale. Then they have to go up the dragon's back, down here, down this vertical shaft in order to get to the Dinaledi chamber, which is where the fossils are located. I will go, you can look up videos of this site, and I will go ahead and post links to, it was National Geographic did a few videos on this site. I will post those for you guys to see and get an idea. Usually I show these in class, but obviously online I can't do that. But I will post them for you. There's a few YouTube videos. So Homo naledi had more in common with Homo erectus, like the sagittal keel, large brow ridge, smaller teeth, mandible, and a human-like foot, well suited for bipedalism. In 2017, the Homo naledi site was dated to just 335 to 236,000 years ago, which is a time that overlaps with Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, and possibly the very beginnings of Homo sapiens in Africa. So what this date range suggests, is that the Homo genus included several contemporaneous species up until very recently. Okay. Next is Homo floresiensis. Recent evidence suggests that humans overlapped with another Homo species even more recently than they overlapped with Neanderthals. So around 16,000 to 18,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens lived throughout Southeast Asia and Australia, there was an unusual species called Homo floresiensis occupying the Indonesian island of Flores. They had small teeth, orthognathic faces similar to other late Homo species, but they also had somewhat more primitive locomotor adaptations, things like the long arms and flat feet. They were also sophisticated hunters that made and used flake tools, and they were remarkably short, with their stature of about 3 to 3.5 feet. They had small cranial capacities, around 400 cc's, and those unusual body proportions contributed to their nickname of hobbits. Researchers have hotly debated the reason behind their unusual size, and most of them argue that it's the result of an evolutionary process rather than some type of pathology that led them to being so small. The Homo floresiensis lineage appears to have been subject to a process known as island or endemic dwarfism. This process, what happens is that it happens even to the animals that are large on the mainland, often will become smaller on islands, which is an adaptation response to the limited amount of available resources. Homo floresiensis was probably a lineage of Homo erectus, or perhaps even Homo sapiens, that became a dwarf population after settling on the Isle of Flores. The same island dwarfism process has resulted in other dwarf animals on the island, such as dwarf elephants. So it's really this idea that it's just island dwarfism rather than a pathological reason for why they are smaller in size. Then we have the Denisovans. So in 2008, researchers working in a Siberian cave called Denisova discovered a fossilized hand phalanx fragment of a child. So this is a really small piece of bone. It's a fragment of a finger bone. Because the archaeological context was dated to around 30 to 48,000 years ago, the investigators hoped that the fossil contained some organic material that was not fully fossilized, and they submitted it for DNA analysis. They assumed that the mitochondrial DNA analysis would indicate that the bone had actually belonged to a Neanderthal or a human, but both of which lived in the surrounding area at the time, but they were surprised to find out that the bone was identified as neither Neanderthal nor human, but something entirely different and previously unknown, and what we have now called the Denisovans. Since then, since 2008, 2 teeth and a foot bone have also been recovered from this same cave. So researchers believe that the Denisovans, they are more closely related to Neanderthals than to humans, and they diverge from the human lineage as long as 700,000 years ago. Genetic evidence indicates that Denisovans, like the Neanderthals, interbred with humans, and some modern humans from Southeast Asian islands and Australia share as much as 6% of their genome with Denisovans. Interestingly, Denisovan genetic markers have not yet been found in people outside of this region. So modern Tibetans have a gene, EPAS1, that has also been found in Denisovan DNA. This gene helps Tibetans to live at these extremely high altitudes, and it seems to have been inherited when ancient humans and the Denisovans interbred approximately 40,000 years ago. Denisovans also interbred with Neanderthals, as we see in a 2018 analysis of DNA recovered from another older bone fragment from Siberia. This bone is about 90,000 years old. The small piece of bone belonged to a female who researchers nicknamed Denny. Denny had mitochondrial DNA from a Neanderthal mother, but a relatively equal amount of nuclear DNA from both Neanderthal and Denisovan lineages. So the nuclear DNA pattern indicates that Denny inherited one set of chromosomes from a Neanderthal mother and another set from a Denisovan father, which is very interesting to see. Okay, and that is the end of the lab. The last thing I'm going to end it with is this timeline of the later Homo species. Like I said, it really gives you this idea of the overlap that we find within the different species, right? It's not like one species came and gave rise and then died off, and then another species came and proliferated and died off, right? They did overlap with each other, right? And here we have it broken into Africa, Asia, Europe, and then the timelines. And that's it. That is the entire lab. If you have any questions, feel free to message me and I can answer them, whatever you need answered. Okay, good luck on the last quiz and on the assignments, and the grades will be uploaded as soon as they're finalized.